At 50, I fell in love with a rich man's 20-year-old son. I wanted him so much that he seemed to sense me, and I'll start from the beginning. I felt it the moment he walked in. Not just the presence of another person in the sprawling emptiness of this house, but something sharper, like the air shifting when a storm approaches. I'd lived in the background for so long, quietly blending into polished floors and folded linens, that I forgot what it felt like to be truly aware of someone. And then Alec arrived. 50 years of life have settled on me gently, though sometimes I feel as if time has worn me thin, a figure erased around the edges. The Ortiz family barely notices me. Their world is gilded, full of designer drapes and plans for cocktail parties that glitter until dawn. My life, in comparison, is practical, routine, invisible. But Alec wasn't invisible. I first saw him when I was dusting the library. The warm Californian sunlight framed his figure as he leaned against the doorway, a book in hand, glancing at me with a casual ease that was rare in this house. He smiled, a lazy, bright thing that made the ordinary seem suddenly electric.
"Hi," he said.
His voice carried a lightness, a kind of energy I hadn't expected. My response was automatic, polite. But as I continued my task, I could feel his eyes on me, not in the indifferent way others in this house looked through me, but as if he actually saw me. The thought lingered, brushing against me softly, like the edge of a breeze catching a loose thread. That day, I learned that Alec was 20, home for the summer, and pursuing a career as an actor. His parents mentioned it with a sort of dismissive pride reserved for youthful whims, but the spark in his eyes hinted at something more than a fleeting ambition. He moved through the house like it belonged to him, but didn't define him, a boy on the edge of becoming something more. As the days went on, I found myself noticing him more. The way he would stand with one hand resting on the banister, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the golden skin of his forearms. The laughter in his voice when he spoke with his sister, though she rarely paid him much attention. His presence was magnetic, pulling my gaze even when I willed myself to look away. That night, after he arrived, I lay awake longer than usual. The darkened ceiling above my small room seemed vast, as though the air was filled with a new weight. I told myself it was nothing, a passing thought, and yet I could still see the way the sunlight caught in his dark hair, the curve of his mouth when he smiled. I didn't yet know what this would become. At that moment, I only knew one thing. For the first time in years, my pulse quickened in a way that had nothing to do with rushing to meet someone else's demands. I told myself it was just a moment, a spark that flickered briefly and would die as quickly as it came. But the next morning, when I walked into the living room with a dust cloth in hand, I saw him again, and the flame reignited. Alec was sprawled in an armchair, sunlight spilling through the wide windows and pooling at his feet. He held a worn notebook, the pages dog-eared and filled with scribbles. His face was a study in concentration, his dark brows furrowed, his lips slightly parted. He looked young and untamed, as if the polished walls of this house couldn't contain him. I hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether to disturb him. He glanced up suddenly, catching my gaze, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "Can I ask for a favor?" he said, his tone casual, but his expression anything but. There was something deeper there, a flicker of vulnerability, a need to be heard. I nodded before I could think it through, and he straightened, flipping through the pages of his notebook. As he began to read, the room seemed to shrink, folding in around his voice. It wasn't the words alone, though they were passionate and raw. It was the way he delivered them, as though every syllable mattered. His voice carried the weight of someone desperate to be understood, to make an impression on a world that might otherwise overlook him. I stood there, clutching my cloth, utterly still. For the first time in years, I felt as though someone had peeled back the layers of ordinary life and shown me something rare. Alec wasn't like the others in this house. He burned brighter. When he finished, he looked up, searching my face for a reaction. I realized then that he was waiting for validation, and the thought startled me. That was beautiful. I finally managed, my voice softer than I intended. His smile lit up the room, warm and genuine. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying a sincerity that made my chest tighten. As I left the room, my steps faltered. I felt exposed, as though he had seen through me in a way I wasn't prepared for. The sound of his voice lingered, each word a thread weaving itself into the fabric of my thoughts. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, staring at the dim outline of the ceiling, Alec's voice echoing in my mind. It wasn't just his performance, though that had been mesmerizing. It was him, his energy, his presence. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself it was foolish. He was young, vibrant, and filled with a fire I hadn't felt in years. But the more I tried to suppress it, the more insistent the feeling became, like a melody I couldn't stop humming. By the time the first light of dawn crept through my window, I knew that whatever had been ignited wasn't going to fade so easily. It was late, the kind of late where silence cloaks everything in the house, and only the faint hum of the refrigerator keeps you company. I was finishing up the aftermath of one of their parties, scrubbing glasses until they gleamed. The night had stretched endlessly, my body weary, but my thoughts restless. As I stacked the last plate, I heard it, a faint shuffle of feet descending the stairs. My pulse quickened, a small spike of awareness cutting through my exhaustion. I turned just as Alec appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled, his shirt hanging loose over his frame. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly, his voice filling the quiet space. "Neither could I, though I didn't say it." Instead, I nodded and tried to busy myself, wiping down the counter as if the surface hadn't already been cleaned twice. The air between us felt different, charged in a way I didn't fully understand. He moved closer, leaning casually against the counter, but his gaze was anything but casual. It lingered on me, thoughtful and unhurried, as though he was seeing something that no one else bothered to notice. I reached for the glass of wine left behind by one of the guests, its ruby glow catching the dim kitchen light. Without thinking, I offered it to him, the action instinctive. He smiled, slow and deliberate, before taking it from my hand. We sat together at the kitchen table, an odd pairing in the vast emptiness of the house. The wine was smooth, its warmth spreading through me with every sip. Alec's presence felt magnetic, drawing me closer without him even trying. As he talked, I found myself leaning in, captivated by the way he spoke, how his hands moved as he described his dreams. He wanted to be more than just the son of privilege, more than a name tied to wealth. He wanted to create something, to leave a mark. I had never felt so seen. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he looked at me, as if I were a part of the world he wanted to understand, rather than just a shadow passing through it. For a moment, I let myself forget who I was, just Maria, the maid. I let the warmth of his attention seep into the spaces I had long thought numb. I hadn't felt this alive in years. His hand rested on the edge of the table, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. My own hand itched to close the distance, to test what this connection might become. But I didn't move. As dawn began to creep through the windows, casting the room in soft hues of gray, we finally stood. I busied myself with clearing the glasses, and he hesitated in the doorway, watching me. "Good night, Maria," he murmured, his voice heavy with something unspoken. And then he was gone, leaving the room emptier than before, but filling me with a thrill I couldn't shake. I told myself the night before had meant nothing. I told myself to forget it, to let it dissolve into the rhythm of my duties. But Alec lingered in my mind, his presence as vivid as the smell of lemons in a freshly cleaned kitchen. I was polishing the countertops when I sensed him again, his footsteps light but unmistakable. Before I turned, I felt the air shift, that now familiar electricity charging the space between us. He didn't speak, but I could feel his gaze pressing into me, studying me with an intensity that sent warmth coursing through me. I turned slowly, finding him closer than I expected. His dark eyes seemed darker, filled with a heat I hadn't noticed before. My breath caught in my throat as he stepped forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried, like he knew I wouldn't stop him. I froze, every thought scattering as his hand brushed against mine. It was barely a touch, but it ignited something deep, something I had buried long ago beneath years of routine and responsibility. The warmth of his skin seeped into mine, and I forgot everything, my role, my place, the boundaries I had promised myself I wouldn't cross. He leaned in slowly, his breath mingling with mine in the charged stillness. I should have moved, should have created distance, but I didn't. I stayed rooted, the heat of him drawing me closer until his lips met mine. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was filled with urgency, as though the restraint we had both held onto for days had finally snapped. My senses flooded, the firmness of his mouth, the faint scent of cologne mixed with the salt of the ocean air clinging to his skin. The kitchen, with its polished counters and pristine order, faded away. The world narrowed to just this, his hands sliding around my waist, pulling me into the warmth of him, the way his body felt solid against mine. His touch was unhurried but deliberate, each movement sending ripples of sensation through me. We moved together, our breaths quickening, the cool surface of the kitchen table pressing against my back. His lips trailed to the curve of my neck, each kiss a question I answered by pulling him closer. My skin burned under his touch, the restraint I had clung to melting into something raw and consuming. And then, the sound of footsteps echoed down the stairs, shattering the cocoon of intimacy we had wrapped ourselves in. We broke apart, our breathing ragged. His hand lingered on mine for a moment longer, as though he wasn't ready to let go. The footsteps grew louder, and reality crashed back in. I pulled away, my heart pounding as I grabbed a dish towel, pretending to busy myself just as his mother entered the room. Alex stood motionless for a beat, his expression unreadable, before stepping back into the shadows of the hallway. I couldn't look up. My hands trembled as I wiped at a counter already spotless, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. I avoided him the next day, not out of shame, though the remnants of guilt simmered low in my chest, but because I didn't trust myself. My hands betrayed my thoughts, trembling as I folded linens. My skin seemed to carry the memory of his touch, each moment with him replaying in vivid flashes. But Alec was not the type to be ignored. It was late afternoon when he found me in the laundry room. The heat of the dryers filled the space, and the steady rhythm of their hum usually brought comfort, but not today. My heart lurched as I heard the door creak open. I knew it was him before I even turned. The space felt smaller with him in it. The air between us thickened, charged with a tension that had nowhere to go in such a confined room. His presence was overwhelming, his body filling the doorway as if to block any chance of escape. He didn't speak at first, and neither did I. My focus remained on the towel in my hands, but my pulse betrayed me, hammering against my ribs. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, until his shadow cast long over the folding table. I couldn't look up. Not yet. I know what you're thinking, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. But did I? Because even as I tried to convince myself this was wrong, A part of me burned with anticipation, my body leaning toward him without my consent. When I finally met his gaze, it was like the dam broke. His eyes were alight with a hunger that mirrored my own, and the restraint I'd tried so hard to maintain slipped through my fingers. He reached for me, his hand grazing my arm with the lightest touch, and yet it was enough to undo me. I felt myself move closer, as if drawn by some unseen force. The room grew warmer, the steady hum of the machines fading into the background as my world narrowed to the inches between us. His lips found mine again, but this time there was no hesitation, no pause to second-guess. He kissed me as if the world outside had ceased to exist, his hands sliding to my waist, pulling me against him. The hard press of his body was both grounding and exhilarating, every nerve in me coming alive under his touch. There, amid baskets of unfolded clothes and the clean scent of detergent, the passion we'd tried to suppress ignited. His touch was firm, possessive, but there was tenderness in the way his fingers brushed the curve of my hip, as though he was memorizing me, moment by moment. I forgot where we were, who we were. My thoughts dissolved into sensation, the heat of his breath against my skin, the subtle graze of his fingers tracing paths that left me trembling. The world outside the laundry room didn't matter. Here, in this moment, it was just him and me, untethered from the rules of reality. After that day, the air between us changed irrevocably. The house, once a place of monotony and rigid boundaries, transformed into a landscape filled with unspoken promises and fleeting moments stolen in secret. It felt dangerous, reckless, and yet I craved it more with each passing hour. We didn't plan these encounters. They simply happened, as though the gravity between us was too strong to resist. A glance across the dining room as I cleared away the plates, his eyes lingering on me just a fraction too long. A brush of hands in the narrow hallway, electricity sparking from the briefest contact. These moments became our language, each touch a sentence, each glance a confession. I found myself moving differently through the house, my senses heightened, always aware of his proximity. The spaces I once moved through invisibly now seemed alive with possibility. The kitchen, the garden, even the darkened corners of the library, everywhere was a stage for our silent game. One afternoon, I was tending to the flowers near the patio when I felt him behind me. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. His presence was as familiar to me now as my own shadow. He didn't speak, just stood there, letting the moment stretch, the weight of his attention sending shivers down my spine. I kept my hands busy, plucking at leaves, but my breath quickened as I felt the heat of him draw closer. His fingers brushed the nape of my neck, featherlight but deliberate, and I froze, the sunlight suddenly too warm on my skin. "You'll get caught," I murmured, though my voice lacked conviction. But he didn't stop, his hand trailing down my arm, leaving a path of fire in its wake. I turned then, unable to resist the pull of his gaze. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of longing and defiance that stole the breath from my lungs. It was madness, but I didn't care. In those stolen moments, I wasn't a 50-year-old woman bound by the expectations of others. I was alive, vibrant, desired. Our encounters grew bolder, each one a dance on the edge of discovery. A fleeting kiss behind the garden shed, his hand lingering on my waist as I passed him in the hallway, the way his fingers would graze mine when he handed me a glass. Every touch was a risk, every glance a promise. The fear of being caught only added to the thrill. I would lie awake at night, replaying every moment, my heart pounding as if the mere memory of him could set my body alight. But even as I reveled in this newfound connection, a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered warnings. This couldn't last. It was a house of cards built on fragile moments, and I knew it could all come crashing down at any moment. Still, I couldn't stop. The risk only made it sweeter, the danger more intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. And I wasn't ready to let that go. The house was unusually quiet that day, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like something is waiting to happen. I had spent the morning immersed in tasks, my hands scrubbing and folding while my thoughts drifted to him. The memory of his touch clung to me, a warmth I couldn't shake no matter how much distance I tried to create between us. By late afternoon, I realized we were alone. The family had gone out, leaving the house eerily still. I told myself it was a relief, that the absence of watchful eyes would make it easier to breathe. But when I heard his footsteps approaching, my resolve cracked. He appeared in the doorway of the laundry room, leaning against the frame with that casual confidence that always left me unsteady. His presence filled the space, and before I could find words, he spoke, his voice low, deliberate.
Come upstairs.
There was no hesitation in his tone, and for a moment, I stared at him, unsure if I had heard correctly. My heart raced, and the walls seemed to close in around me. Everything about this was reckless, dangerous. I should have said no, but I didn't. I followed him, my steps slow, as though every stair was testing my will. The air grew heavier as we ascended, the intimacy of the moment wrapping around me like a cocoon. His room was tucked at the end of the long hallway, a space I had never entered before. The door clicked softly behind us, sealing us in a world that felt entirely separate from the rest of the house. The room smelled faintly of him, a mix of clean linen and something unmistakably his. The sunlight filtered through the half-drawn curtains, casting warm, golden stripes across the bed. My breath hitched as he turned to face me, the space between us shrinking. I didn't have time to think. His hands found my waist, his touch firm, yet gentle, and he drew me closer. The warmth of his body was intoxicating, his presence overwhelming in the small room. My heart pounded in my chest, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation, a wild, breathless energy coursing through me. He kissed me, and everything else fell away. There was no house, no world beyond this room. Only the sensation of his lips against mine, the way his hands slid over my back, grounding me even as I felt like I might float away. He guided me backward, the edge of the bed meeting the backs of my thighs. His movements were slow, deliberate, his touch exploring as if memorizing every curve. My body responded instinctively, arching toward him, surrendering to the pull that had been building between us for days. The sunlight shifted as the minutes passed, but I lost track of time. All that mattered was him. The way his breath mingled with mine, the heat of his skin, the way his touch unraveled me piece by piece. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist, and I let myself fall entirely into the sensation of him, into the reckless, consuming risk of it all. The room was bathed in the golden haze of late afternoon, the quiet ticking of the bedside clock the only sound apart from our labored breaths. His fingers still traced absent patterns on my skin, his warmth lingering against me like a second layer. I was weightless, suspended in the intimacy of the moment, the world outside reduced to a distant hum. And then I heard it, the sharp click of the front door unlocking. My body stiffened instantly, the spell shattered. His hand froze, his eyes snapping to mine with a mixture of surprise and tension. The soft murmur of voices drifted up the staircase, followed by the sound of footsteps, measured, deliberate, unmistakable. They were home. Panic gripped me, sharp and immediate, pulling me from the haze of bliss. My heart raced, hammering against my ribs as if trying to escape. Alec moved quickly, his hands steady even as mine shook. He whispered something calm, soothing, but the words barely registered. My mind was already racing, searching for a way to disappear, to erase the evidence of what had just happened. He led me to the en-suite bathroom, the small space dimly lit by the fading sunlight filtering through the shutters. I slipped inside, the door closing softly behind me. The small click of the lock felt deafening in the tense silence. I pressed my back against the cool tile wall, my chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Every noise from the hallway seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the distant murmur of voices, the sound of footsteps coming closer, and then fading away. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I could hear Alec outside the door, his voice calm and steady as he greeted his parents. There was a casualness to his tone, an effortless charm that belied the chaos brewing just feet away. My mind raced through 1,000 worst-case scenarios, each one more disastrous than the last. The minutes stretched, each one feeling longer than the last, as I stood there, frozen in the small space. My skin still carried the warmth of his touch, a stark contrast to the cold panic spreading through my veins. Eventually, the sounds from the hallway began to fade, the tension easing as their footsteps retreated downstairs. My breathing slowed, the tight grip of fear loosening its hold. A soft knock on the bathroom door startled me, and when I cracked it open, Alex stood there, his expression calm but his eyes betraying the same adrenaline still coursing through me. He reached for my hand, squeezing it gently before guiding me out of the room. His composure steadied me, though my legs felt shaky as I followed him down a different staircase, slipping out the back door unnoticed. The fresh air hit my face like a shock, and I exhaled deeply, my shoulders sagging with relief. I didn't speak, and neither did he. But as our eyes met, a new understanding passed between us. We had been reckless, foolish, but the thrill of it, the fire that still burned between us, made it impossible to regret. I thought the fear of being caught would temper whatever had grown between us, but instead, it made it burn hotter. For days after, every glance he cast in my direction, every fleeting touch as he passed, felt like kindling added to a fire already raging. I lived in a state of constant tension, torn between the magnetic pull of him and the weight of what we were risking. I avoided mirrors during those days. I couldn't bear to look myself in the eye and see the woman I had become, someone who clung to moments of passion at the expense of reason. Yet, even as I tried to suppress it, the memory of his touch lingered on my skin, his voice an echo in my thoughts. But something shifted. It was subtle at first, a quiet hesitance in his smile, a pause before he approached me. I felt the distance growing between us like a fissure, and though neither of us spoke of it, the truth was unavoidable. We were hurtling towards something inevitable. It happened in the garden. I was pruning roses, my hands busy, my thoughts clouded. The sun was warm on my back, but my chest felt hollow, weighed down by the knowledge that this couldn't last. He found me there, stepping into the dappled shade without a sound, his presence as magnetic as ever. When I turned to face him, his expression was unreadable, guarded, conflicted. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the words we hadn't said, all the things we couldn't bring ourselves to admit. I put down the shears, my hands trembling slightly as I met his gaze. "This has to stop," I said finally, my voice soft but resolute. The words felt foreign, as though they didn't belong to me, but I knew they were necessary. His brow furrowed, and for a moment, I saw the boy beneath the man he was becoming, uncertain, vulnerable. "Maria," he began, but I shook my head. "No," I said, more firmly this time. We can't keep doing this. The pain in his eyes was sharp, cutting through me like the thorns on the roses I had been trimming. He stepped closer, and I felt the familiar pull, the instinct to reach for him, to forget everything but the way he made me feel. "You are the only one who ever saw me," he said, his voice breaking just slightly. "Really saw me." Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away. He deserved honesty, even if it hurt. "And you made me feel alive," I whispered. "But this, it's not ours to have." He stood there for a moment longer, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides, before finally nodding. He turned and walked away, and I stayed in the garden, the roses blurring as tears finally fell. The weight of what we'd shared and what we'd lost settled over me, bittersweet and unrelenting. Time moved strangely after Alec left. The house seemed emptier, quieter, though nothing about it had truly changed. His absence lingered in every corner, in the sunlit spaces where we'd crossed paths, in the soft creak of the floorboards that once signaled his approach. I tried to bury myself in work, scrubbing surfaces and folding linens with a rigor that should have erased the memories, but they clung to me stubbornly. His laughter echoed in my mind, the feel of his hands still vivid against my skin. I would catch myself pausing in the middle of a task, lost in the recollection of his gaze, the way it had made me feel seen, cherished, alive. Word reached the house not long after he left. He had gone to New York, chasing the dream that had always seemed just beyond his grasp. His parents spoke of him in passing, their voices tinged with pride, but their words felt hollow. They didn't understand what he was pursuing or why. But I did. In the quiet of my evenings, I would imagine him there, a city teeming with ambition, its pulse quick and unrelenting. I pictured him on a stage, his voice commanding, his presence magnetic. He would be brilliant, I knew, because he carried within him a fire that couldn't be extinguished. The ache of missing him was sharp at first, a wound that refused to heal. But as the weeks turned into months, it softened into something different. Not a void, but a fullness, a warm, lingering memory of what we had shared. Sometimes, late at night, I would stand by the window overlooking the garden. The roses were blooming, their petals rich and fragrant, the air filled with the scent of life renewing itself. It was there, in the stillness, that I allowed myself to feel everything. The thrill of our moments together, the bittersweet sting of letting go, the quiet gratitude for having known him at all. I never told anyone about Alec, and I never would. It wasn't a story meant for the world. It was mine alone. A chapter of my life written in the language of risk and desire, of vulnerability and connection. It had changed me in ways I couldn't fully articulate, awakening parts of me I thought had long been silenced. As time passed, I found myself smiling at the thought of him, not with sadness, but with a kind of joy, a recognition of what he had given me. He had reminded me that I was still capable of feeling deeply, of being more than just a shadow in someone else's life. One day, as I tended to the roses, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman staring back at me looked different, not younger, but alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. I smiled, not for what had been lost, but for what had been found. Alec was gone, but the trace he left behind was indelible, and for that, I would always be grateful. Thank you for being with me until the end. Like and subscribe to Nasty Talks.